Imagine walking into a restaurant, expecting nothing more than a warm, delicious meal. The clink of cutlery, the murmur of casual conversation, and the soft hum of background music, it all feels so familiar, so safe. But what if, in that moment, you weren't as alone as you thought? What if the comfort of the table before you, the food that should nourish you, was hiding something darker? Something was lurking beneath that silverware, beneath that smile of the waiter, something that had no business being there, yet somehow was. Imagine looking at your meal, only to feel a presence you couldn't explain, a coldness that runs deeper than any chill you've ever felt before. Something or someone was waiting, watching. The walls that were supposed to protect you weren't. For those who've been there, the story doesn't end when the bill comes. In fact, for them, that's where the nightmare began. Before we dive into tonight's chilling tales, here's something you might not know. Many viewers make the mistake of leaving without subscribing. But when they do, they miss out on the creepiest, most terrifying stories, the kind that only the bravest horror fans get to experience. Don't make that mistake. Hit that subscribe button now, because what's coming next is only the beginning. And as the darkness unfolds, you won't want to be left in the dark. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments, because tonight, the terror is just beginning. It was late, far later than he had planned to be out, but something about the night seemed to draw him in. Maybe it was hunger, or perhaps the quiet pull of a place he couldn't quite explain. He had driven through the dimly lit streets, feeling the weight of the dark settling in, until he noticed a flicker of neon light in the distance. The sign was old, faded, and swayed with the wind like a forgotten memory. The lantern. He hadn't seen it before, but there was something oddly familiar about it, something that felt both inviting and unsettling. With a hesitant glance at the empty street around him, he pulled into the parking lot, his headlights casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement. The building loomed ahead, framed by creeping ivy and trees that seemed to stretch toward the sky, as if trying to pull the restaurant deeper into the night. He paused for a moment, his fingers gripping the steering wheel. The air was thick with mist, and the world felt unnaturally still. Shaking off the feeling, he stepped out of the car and walked toward the door. The soft creak of the building settling beneath his weight echoed in the silence, a strange sound that seemed to reverberate just a little too loudly. The door opened with a groan, and as he entered, the first thing that hit him was the smell, an odd blend of aged wood, faint spices, and something slightly metallic. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't comforting either. Inside, the atmosphere felt thick, almost stifling. The low murmur of background music barely reached his ears, and there was no chatter, no laughter to welcome him, just the oppressive silence that filled the dimly lit space. The only movement came from the soft flickering of a single overhead light. Tables lined the room in a disordered fashion, as though no one had bothered to set them straight in years. The restaurant felt frozen in time, a place that hadn't changed in decades, untouched by the usual rush of patrons, untouched by the world outside. The man settled into the corner seat, the one by the window, half expecting the light outside to offer him some sense of reassurance. But as he looked out into the fog-heavy street, it only seemed to deepen the emptiness around him. The restaurant, as if alive, seemed to exhale its cold breath, the walls closing in on him with each passing second. He was alone. A strange kind of stillness hung in the air, one that pressed against his chest, making each breath feel just a little heavier than the last. A part of him told him to leave, to walk away and forget about the eerie sense that wrapped itself around his heart, but the hunger gnawing at him held him in place. The minutes stretched on, endlessly, until he finally broke the silence by glancing back at the waitress. She was standing at the far end of the counter, her back to him, the dim light above casting long shadows over her figure. When she turned, the motion was too deliberate, as if she had been waiting for him to look. Her eyes met his, not with the usual warmth or courtesy, but with an intensity that made his stomach flip. There was no smile, no welcoming expression, just a hollow gaze that lingered for far too long, her head tilted slightly, almost as though she was studying him. For a moment, he wondered if she was waiting for him to say something, but no words came. And then, without a word, she moved toward him. Her footsteps were quiet, too quiet. In a room like this, where each step should have echoed across the floor, her movements seemed muffled, as if the very sound of her presence had been swallowed by the space. When she arrived at his table, she didn't ask how he was, or if he was ready to order. Instead, she simply placed the menu in front of him with a smooth, almost practiced motion. "What will it be tonight?" Her voice was calm, so calm it was unsettling. The kind of calm you might expect from someone who has learned how to hide their emotions behind a mask. Her eyes never left his face. His pulse quickened as she stared at him, unblinking, waiting for him to speak. He turned his attention to the menu in front of him, trying to focus on the list of dishes. But something about the way the words were arranged struck him as odd. They weren't quite like the menu he had expected. The descriptions were too detailed, too specific, almost too personal. The dishes weren't just listed. They were described with a kind of intimacy, as though the chef had seen them in his dreams, had known them for years. He glanced back up at the waitress, but she had already turned away, moving silently toward the kitchen, her back to him. No more words, no more glances. The silence was oppressive now. The man could feel his heart beat a little faster, a little harder. Something about the way she left. It was as if she wasn't just taking the order. She was leaving him with something. A feeling that lingered, just on the edge of his awareness, like a shadow in the corner of his eye. He looked at the menu again, then back at the empty room, and for the first time he felt it. That quiet sense of dread, like the restaurant itself was watching him. But no one else was there. Just the faint hum of the old ceiling fan, and the sound of his own breath filling the space. The man tried to ignore the unsettling feeling, but it grew harder with each passing minute. He focused on his meal, trying to convince himself it was just the isolation of the place, the quiet, that was messing with his head. But then it started, soft whispers, barely audible, like a breath against his ear. He froze. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the hum of the lights. It was a voice, faint but clear, as though someone were standing right next to him, whispering words he couldn't quite make out. His pulse quickened. He turned quickly to his side, expecting to find someone there. But no one was. The restaurant remained still, the only sound the quiet clink of silverware. But he couldn't shake the feeling. He wasn't alone. He tried to go back to his meal, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. Scraping. The soft, unsettling sound of metal against porcelain. He glanced down at the table, his eyes narrowing as he saw the fork on his plate slowly shift across the surface, as if moved by an unseen hand. His breath caught in his throat. No one was touching it. No one was even near his table. The sound stopped as suddenly as it started, and he looked around the restaurant again. The other diners were still there, somewhere deep in their meals. None of them seemed to notice the strange, unnerving quiet that had settled over him. But there it was again, another fork, sliding ever so slightly across a neighboring table, moving of its own accord. He blinked, trying to rationalize it, but he couldn't. He was beginning to feel the pressure of invisible eyes on him, watching him from every corner of the room. Just as he was about to leave, his unease building, his meal long forgotten, he saw her again. The waitress. She was standing in front of him, staring at him with those cold, unwavering eyes. But this time, there was something different in her expression, something more knowing. She stood still for a long moment, and then, without any hint of emotion, she leaned forward slightly, her lips curling into something that almost resembled a smile. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice low, almost a hiss. The words sent a chill down his spine, a warning, or perhaps a statement of fact. Before he could respond, the lights above them flickered. Once, twice, then went out entirely. The entire room plunged into darkness, except for a faint glow from the streetlight outside that barely illuminated the space. For a moment, the restaurant felt like it was holding its breath. And then, just as the lights flickered back to life, he saw it. A shadow, tall, indistinct, looming behind the waitress. It was there for a split second, just long enough for him to see the silhouette of a figure, long and unnervingly thin. The figure was bent, its face hidden in the shadow. And then, in the dim light, he saw it lean toward the waitress and whisper something directly into her ear. Something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He couldn't hear the words, but the way the figure's mouth moved, it seemed like it was speaking to her, no, controlling her. The waitress didn't flinch. She didn't move. The man's heart pounded. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back, and bolted for the door. The cool night air hit him like a slap as he ran into the street, his breath ragged, his eyes wide with panic. The restaurant behind him seemed to pull away, fading into the mist. He didn't stop running until he was back at his car, hands trembling as he fumbled with the keys. He slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. For the rest of the night, he tried to convince himself that it was all in his head, that he had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Something about that restaurant had been off. The next day, he could still feel the strange presence haunting him, pulling at his thoughts. He couldn't stop thinking about the waitress, her strange warning, the shadow behind her. Unable to shake the feeling, he turned to the internet. He found the restaurant's website, searching for any information, hoping for some logical explanation. That's when he stumbled across an article, buried in the archives. It told the story of a strange disappearance. Years ago, a waitress had gone missing from that very restaurant. No one had ever seen her again, and no one could explain what had happened. But the most chilling part? The last time she was seen, she had been standing at the same counter, her eyes locked on a lone diner, just like him. And the article mentioned something else, something that sent chills crawling down his spine. It said the restaurant had been built on the site of an old, abandoned house, one that had burned down under mysterious circumstances. They had never been able to explain the fire. And of course, no one had ever bothered to look deeper into the disappearance. But the man knew. He knew deep down that what he had seen was something that had never left that place. Something dark, something ancient. It was supposed to be a special night, a rare treat at one of the city's most exclusive fine dining restaurants. The woman had been looking forward to the evening for weeks, craving not just the exquisite food, but the atmosphere of luxury and elegance. She was seated near the kitchen, a spot she often preferred to feel closer to the action, the artistry of the chefs at work. The restaurant buzzed with a quiet hum, the clinking of silverware, the soft murmur of guests, and the occasional flicker of candlelight. But something was off about the place. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she felt it, a strange weight in the air, an unnatural stillness that hung just below the surface. The kitchen was visible from her seat, and as she watched the chefs at work, she noticed one in particular. The head chef, who had a reputation for being a genius in the culinary world, moved with a precision that bordered on mechanical. He didn't speak to anyone. Not the waitstaff, not the sous chefs, not even the diners. He simply worked, his hands moving swiftly and silently, each motion calculated, as though he was locked in a trance. The kitchen was alive with activity, pots clanging, burners hissing, but the head chef remained detached, his focus never wavering, his eyes never straying from his work. She couldn't help but watch him, drawn to his eerie, almost robotic demeanor. But as the minutes passed, she felt a strange unease settle within her. This was a man who seemed to have no soul in the room, no connection to the bustling energy around him. And as she looked closer, she realized that the longer she watched, the more she began to feel like she wasn't the only one observing him. The woman's meal arrived, a masterpiece, as expected from such a renowned establishment. The dish was artfully presented, vibrant colors arranged in a way that looked almost too beautiful to eat. But as she took her first bite, a shiver ran through her, though it wasn't the kind of shiver one gets from cold food. No, this sensation was something deeper, something far more unsettling. The flavor exploded in her mouth, but it wasn't just the taste that left her breathless, it was the sheer perfection of it. It was as though the dish was crafted not only to please the senses, but to transcend them. A flavor she had never encountered, a combination of ingredients she couldn't place, yet her body knew instinctively. It was flawless, too flawless. Each bite seemed to draw her further in, as though the food was connecting with something inside her, something old, something hidden. And yet, with every mouthful, there was an undercurrent of dread that began to seep into her mind. It was subtle at first, like the faintest hint of bitterness that lingered on the edge of the taste, just enough to unsettle her, to remind her that this perfect meal was not as it seemed. She pushed the thought aside and took another bite, but as she did, she felt something shift, something beyond the flavor. A chill. It wasn't the temperature of the food, nor the air around her. It was the coldness she felt each time the chef's gaze swept over her, just a brief glance, but always intense, always unwavering. His eyes locked onto her, and every time they did, the chill grew deeper. It was like an invisible presence pressing in from all sides. He never spoke, not a single word. His eyes alone did the talking, his stare cold and calculating, and as he worked, she could feel his focus on her, pulling her deeper into the unsettling grip of the meal. As she ate, the oddness of the meal seemed to grow with each bite. The room, once filled with a pleasant hum of quiet conversation and clinking glasses, had fallen into a thick silence. The woman couldn't remember the last time she'd heard anyone else's voice. All she could hear now was the clink of her own fork, the soft scraping of silverware on porcelain, and the unsettling stillness that seemed to have overtaken the entire room. The other diners, what few there were, seemed oblivious to her unease. Their faces were fixed, expressionless, focused solely on their meals. It was as though they were in a trance, each one lost in the perfect taste of their food, each unaware of the strange shift in the air. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, an almost imperceptible whisper. She froze. It wasn't coming from the other diners, nor was it from the kitchen. It was coming from somewhere closer, just behind her. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. The whispers faded as soon as she moved, slipping back into the silence. Her heart began to race. Had she imagined it? Or was something or someone trying to get her attention? She reached for her wine glass, her hand trembling as she tried to steady herself. Then it happened. The dish, which had started out as a thing of beauty, began to change before her eyes. The once pristine sauce that had looked so elegant, so perfect, began to shift. It turned a darker shade, as if the very essence of the food was sinking into itself, pulling inward. The black substance, which had been a minor curiosity before, began to rise again, this time thicker, more deliberate. It bubbled from the center of the dish, swirling like a liquid shadow, moving as though it had a life of its own. The woman recoiled, her stomach lurching in sudden horror. She looked up at the chef, sitting in the kitchen behind the bar. His gaze was fixed on her again, and this time it felt different. Cold, predatory, as if he knew exactly what was happening, as if he were waiting for her to react. The woman could feel her pulse quicken, her hand trembling as she set her fork down on the plate. She was no longer hungry. The meal, which had once seemed so extraordinary, now felt like something else entirely, something that shouldn't be consumed. The blackness had risen higher, like a dark, viscous liquid creeping toward the edge of the plate. Her stomach twisted in revolt. It wasn't just the taste anymore, it was the feeling. The unease that had settled in her chest was now suffocating her, a thick weight pressing down with every breath she took. She pushed her chair back and stood abruptly, her legs unsteady. She needed to leave. She needed to get out of this place, away from this food, away from that chef. She made her way toward the door, her steps hurried, but as she reached for the handle, something stopped her. The door wouldn't open. She yanked harder, but it was stuck, the handle refusing to budge. Panic surged within her, and she turned to look at the room, only to find it now eerily silent. The diners around her were still eating, their faces locked in a trance, unaware of her struggle, lost in the dark pull of the meal. The whispers that had been so faint before were now unmistakable, louder, and more urgent, coming from all directions. But the worst part was the chef. He hadn't moved. He was still standing at the kitchen counter, his cold eyes fixed on her. And now, she could see something that made her freeze. A shadow, tall and thin, was standing behind him, almost blending into the darkness of the kitchen. The figure was faint, barely there, but unmistakably human. It was as if the shadow was reaching for him, whispering something into his ear, something that made his eyes twitch, just for a moment in response. And then, the most terrifying realization hit her. The chef wasn't just cooking the food. He was part of it. Her heart hammered in her chest as the door suddenly swung open behind her, the rush of cold air hitting her like a wave. She didn't hesitate. She fled, her legs carrying her toward the exit, not looking back as the whispers followed her. The street outside felt different, too quiet, too empty. She stumbled down the sidewalk, trying to shake the feeling that something was still with her. Her mind raced as she thought about what had just happened, what she had just experienced. But no matter how hard she tried to push it from her mind, she couldn't stop thinking about that shadow, that figure behind the chef. It was as if it had been waiting for her. It had been in the food. It had been there the entire time. The next day, unable to rid herself of the feeling of dread, she did some digging. What she found made her blood run cold. The restaurant had a history, a long, dark history. The chef, a celebrated culinary genius, had been known for his eccentricities, his obsession with creating the perfect dish. But what no one knew was that the chef had disappeared years ago. He had been found dead in his kitchen, his body stiff and cold. But the strange thing was this: there had been no sign of foul play, no sign of anything that would explain his death. No one had ever been able to explain why he died, or why the dishes that he had created after his death still carried that same uncanny perfection. And it wasn't just the chef who had gone missing. Several staff members had disappeared, too, vanishing without a trace, their names erased from the restaurant's records. It was then that she came across a final detail in an old, archived article. The chef had been obsessed with creating dishes that were timeless. He believed food could transcend life and death. His last dish, the one he had spent years perfecting, was rumored to have been cursed for anyone who tasted it. And though he was gone, the dish remained, served in the same restaurant, still carrying his presence. It was as though the curse had lived on in the food, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to claim it. And for the woman, it had claimed her. It was supposed to be a simple evening, just a quiet dinner at a local bistro, a place known for its charming atmosphere and well-loved dishes. The man entered, greeted by the soft murmur of conversation and the scent of freshly baked bread filling the air. The restaurant, while a bit older than most in the city, had an inviting, almost nostalgic charm. The waitstaff was friendly, the music soothing, and the menu looked as delightful as always. But there was something different about tonight. The waiter, a young man with a strange, too-perfect smile, handed him the menu with a flourish. Something about the way he did it felt rehearsed, almost too precise. As the man skimmed over the options, his eye caught something that wasn't usually there, a special of the evening, written in bold script at the top of the page. The chef's secret, it said. He'd never seen it before. Curiosity piqued, he asked the waiter about it. The waiter's smile didn't falter, but there was something unsettling in the way his eyes flickered. "It's our most exclusive dish," the waiter replied, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "It's only available to those who truly want to experience something unique. It's our pride, but only a few know of it. Would you like to try it?" His voice was soft, but the insistence in his tone was impossible to ignore. The man, intrigued by the waiter's unusual insistence, decided to give in. What harm could there be in trying something new, something exclusive, he thought. When the dish arrived, it was nothing like he expected. The presentation was simple but striking, the plate holding a perfectly prepared, almost sculptural arrangement of food. It looked delicious, mouth-watering, even, but there was something about it that didn't sit right. The colors on the plate were unnaturally vibrant, almost glowing under the dim lighting of the restaurant. As he took his first bite, he could feel the food working its way through his senses, an explosion of flavors that he had never tasted before, flavors that seemed to come from a place beyond his understanding. It was as if the dish had unlocked something deep within him. Each bite was perfect, but strangely unsettling at the same time. As the man ate, he noticed a subtle change in the room. The noise from other diners seemed to fade away, and a heavy silence filled the space. He looked around, only to realize that the other patrons had stopped eating. They sat motionless, their faces blank, their eyes distant as if lost in some other world. It was as though the food had affected them too, trapping them in a stillness that mirrored his own growing unease. He glanced up at the waiter, who stood by the kitchen door, watching him intently. The man felt a chill creep up his spine as their eyes met. The waiter's expression had changed, his smile now cold and knowing, as if he were waiting for something to happen, something inevitable. As the man continued eating, the room seemed to grow colder. At first, he chalked it up to the air conditioning, but the chill he felt went deeper than the temperature. It was a bone-deep cold, like something in the room had shifted, and he could feel it all around him. He glanced down at his plate again, his stomach tight with discomfort. The dish, once so inviting, now appeared different. The sauce, which had once looked so vibrant, now looked almost murky, like it was darkening before his very eyes. He reached for his glass of water, his hand trembling slightly, but as he raised it to his lips, he noticed something even stranger. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, drifted through the room, so soft that at first he thought he'd imagined it. It was too low to make out any words, but it was there, just beyond the edge of his hearing, creeping into his consciousness like a murmur from the darkness. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. And then, as if on cue, the noise in the room, once a faint murmur, suddenly erupted into clinking silverware and scraping chairs. The other diners, still seated in their trance-like states, began moving in unison, as though they were puppets controlled by some unseen force. They picked up their utensils, their movements mechanical, as though they were eating without really tasting, without ever looking up. But it wasn't the other diners that caused his stomach to churn in fear. It was the sight of the waiter, still standing in the corner, now holding a plate of the same dish he had just eaten. He wasn't moving. He was simply watching him, his eyes fixed with an intensity that made the man's skin crawl. The air in the room grew heavier, as though it had thickened with something dark, something ancient. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the waiter lifted the plate to his mouth, taking a bite of the dish himself. The man's heart raced as he stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but as he turned toward the door, something held him in place. The whispers had grown louder, now swirling around him like an invisible storm. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were voices. faint, distorted, but unmistakable. The man felt his mind start to unravel as the sound seemed to pull him back into his seat, forcing him to face the plate before him once more. His eyes locked onto the dish, and in that moment he saw it. A faint movement, the surface of the food rippling like water, as if something beneath it was alive. The dark sauce that had once looked harmless now seemed to shift, writhing and twisting in unnatural patterns. He could feel his stomach turning, while rising in his throat. His breath came in shallow gasps, and as his eyes darted back to the kitchen, he saw the waiter standing still, no longer eating, but watching, his face now devoid of expression. His eyes had changed, hollow and empty, like two dark voids. The man could hardly move. The whispers were everywhere now, rising into a cacophony in his head, until suddenly, everything went silent. The room, the people, the food, they all seemed to pause as if holding their collective breath. And then, with a jolt, the waiter moved toward him. The man felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him, a sense of inevitability that he could not escape. Before the man could react, the waiter reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder with a grip that felt far too cold, too firm. "You didn't think it would end here, did you?" The waiter's voice was no longer soft and polite. It was raspy, distant, as though something else was speaking through him. The man struggled to pull away, but the grip tightened, and the whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. He looked around in desperation, but no one else in the restaurant had moved. They were still seated, eyes glazed, their expressions frozen. The man realized, with a sickening lurch, that the diner who had sat here before him, the one whose vision had haunted him earlier, had been just like these people, trapped, caught in the food, bound to the curse of the restaurant. With all his strength, he pulled away from the waiter's grasp and bolted for the door. This time it opened. The chill of the night air hit him like a slap as he stumbled out onto the street, gasping for breath. He didn't look back until he was well away from the restaurant, his heart still racing. But as he stood there, trying to regain his composure, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with him. Something dark, something that had followed him. It wasn't until much later, when he looked up the restaurant's history, that he understood. The bistro had a dark reputation, one that no one had dared speak of. It was said that the original owner, a once famous chef, had been obsessed with creating the perfect dish. A dish so perfect that it could connect the living with the dead. And anyone who ate it, whether knowingly or not, would be forever linked to that darkness. The dish was said to have been cursed, its recipe passed down by the chef's ghost, continuing to claim those who dared to consume it. The man realized too late that he had become one of its victims. It was an elegant restaurant, one of the finest in the city, known for its refined atmosphere and exquisite dishes. The woman, a food enthusiast, had heard rave reviews about the place and was excited to experience it for herself. She was led to her table, a corner spot with a perfect view of the bustling kitchen. The place buzzed with activity, the clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of conversation. Yet something felt off. There was an odd tension in the air, as though everyone was on edge, even though no one spoke about it. The waitstaff moved with practiced efficiency, and the head chef in the open kitchen worked silently, his back turned to the diners as he prepared his dishes with meticulous precision. The atmosphere felt almost too perfect, as if the whole evening was carefully orchestrated to present nothing but seamless beauty and perfection. But when she opened the menu, her attention was immediately drawn to one item that wasn't listed, an exclusive dish marked only with a simple note: Chef's Choice. Curious, she asked the waiter about it. He glanced at her for a brief moment, his smile tight and controlled, before replying, "It's a special creation, only offered to select guests. A dish you won't find anywhere else. Would you like to try it?" His voice was calm, but there was something unsettling in his tone, as though he knew something she didn't. Intrigued, the woman agreed to try the dish. The waiter nodded and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving her with her thoughts and the growing sense that something wasn't quite right. She glanced around the restaurant, observing the other diners. There was no laughter, no chatter, only the quiet clinking of forks and knives, the occasional murmur of a conversation, and the same detached, almost robotic demeanor from everyone around her. The waiter returned soon after, placing a beautifully plated dish in front of her. It was unlike anything she had ever seen before, perfectly arranged, with vibrant colors and an almost surreal glow under the dim restaurant lighting. The fragrance that rose from the plate was intoxicating, a combination of herbs and spices that seemed to stir something deep inside her. It looked exquisite, but as she gazed at the dish, something caught her attention, a faint, almost imperceptible ripple across the surface of the sauce, like something was moving beneath it. The waiter stood by, watching her intently as she reached for her fork. His eyes never left her face, his lips slightly parted as if he was waiting for her to taste it. The woman hesitated for a moment, an inexplicable feeling of unease settling in her stomach. But curiosity won over, and she took her first bite. The moment the food touched her tongue, it was as though the world around her changed. The flavors exploded in her mouth, rich, intense, and completely overwhelming. It was unlike anything she had ever tasted. It was perfect, too perfect. She chewed slowly, savoring the complexity of the dish, but the taste began to feel overwhelming, suffocating even. A strange sensation crept up her spine, and she found herself unable to swallow it quickly enough. It was as though the food was consuming her, not the other way around. As she continued to eat, the flavors seemed to shift, changing in ways that defied reason. The taste that had once been intoxicating now felt almost sickening. It was as though the dish had turned against her, each bite heavier than the last. She could feel the texture of the food in her mouth, but it didn't feel real, more like something unnatural, something foreign. It was as if the dish itself was no longer just food, but something alive, something that had a presence, a weight to it that pressed down on her chest. The air in the room began to thicken, and the once perfect atmosphere seemed to dissolve, replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. The woman glanced up from her plate, her breath shallow. She noticed that the other diners had stopped eating. No one was moving, no one was talking. Their eyes were fixed on their plates, expressionless, their faces drained of color, as if they were in a trance. Her heart began to race, and she looked back at the waiter, whose gaze was still locked on her with an unsettling intensity. He hadn't spoken a word since he brought the dish to her, but his eyes seemed to say everything. "You've tasted it now. It's too late." The thought made her stomach churn, and she pushed her plate away, unable to continue. But as soon as she moved the plate, a strange thing happened. The dish began to move on its own. The sauce, once still, began to shift, swirling as though something beneath the surface was stirring. She blinked in disbelief as the sauce began to rise in small, dark tendrils, curling up from the plate like smoke. She recoiled, her pulse quickening as she stared at the dark, pulsating substance. The woman's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the dish. The tendrils of the dark sauce continued to rise, stretching into the air like thin fingers reaching for her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood, her legs unsteady, but just as she made a move to leave, the waiter stepped in front of her, blocking her path. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, they were different now. Hollow, as if something inside him had been replaced by something ancient, something that didn't belong. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough to freeze her in place. "You can't leave," the waiter's voice came, softer now, almost whispering. "The dish has already chosen you. It has chosen to take you with it." His words sent a chill down her spine, and she instinctively stepped back, her body trembling. The whispers, once soft and distant, now seemed to fill the entire room, crowding her mind. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, clear and desperate, speaking in languages she couldn't understand. She turned her head toward the diners, but they were still seated, their eyes glazed over, their faces empty. It was as though they were already gone, trapped in the same curse that had taken hold of her. The air in the room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though the walls themselves were alive, closing in on her. And then she saw it. Behind the waiter, standing motionless, was a figure. A man, tall and thin, his features obscured by the shadows, his eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. It was the chef, but it wasn't him, not truly. His form flickered, shifting like smoke, his body dissipating and reappearing, as if he were made of something intangible, something that shouldn't exist in the living world. "I see you've met my dish," the chef's voice echoed in the room, but it was no longer a voice that belonged to a human. It was distorted, layered with other voices, as though hundreds of whispers had been trapped within him, speaking through his body. "It's the only way to keep what remains of me alive." The woman backed away, her head spinning as the words twisted around her, but it was too late. The waiter's grip tightened on her arm, and the room seemed to close in, the walls pressing against her, the air thick with a suffocating darkness. With a sudden surge of panic, the woman yanked her arm free from the waiter's grasp and ran for the door. Her body was trembling uncontrollably as she reached for the handle, but the door, as before, wouldn't open. Her heart was pounding, her breath shallow, and the room was spinning. She looked back at the waiter, whose once cold expression now held an unsettling sense of triumph. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, pressing against her mind like a physical weight. She felt herself growing weaker, her vision blurring as she reached for the door again, desperate, but still trapped. It wasn't until she heard a low, guttural laugh behind her that she froze. She turned to see the chef, his form flickering in and out of existence, stepping closer, his ghostly figure becoming more defined. "You cannot leave," he said, his voice like 1,000 voices speaking at once, the sound scraping against her eardrums. "Not until you understand. This dish, it keeps me here. It binds my soul to the world of the living. And now it has chosen you, just as it chose those before you." The woman's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. The chef had died years ago. His obsession with creating the perfect dish had consumed him, and now his soul was trapped, bound to the food he had created. She had unwittingly tasted his masterpiece, the very thing that kept him anchored to the world of the living. And now she was caught in it too. She had become part of the curse, unable to escape. The whispers of past victims, those who had dined in the same cursed restaurant, now flooded her mind. She could see their faces, hear their desperate cries for freedom, but it was too late for them, and now, too late for her. With a final, terrifying lurch of her stomach, the woman found herself on her knees, the world around her spinning as the darkness seemed to pull her down. She closed her eyes, her last thought consumed by the realization that the chef's curse would never end. It would always claim new victims, always serve up the same fateful dish, and she had become its next course. The restaurant closed its doors that night, and when the police arrived to investigate the woman's disappearance, they found no trace of her, no sign of what had happened. The staff had vanished, too, no records, no witnesses, only the lingering scent of the cursed dish in the air. But the bistro, once a favorite among locals, continued to operate. Its chef special remained on the menu, its dark history carefully swept under the rug. And the whispers of those who ate the dish, of those who became part of its dark legacy, were never truly gone. They were only waiting for the next unsuspecting diner. The couple had always prided themselves on their love of fine dining, so when they heard about the newest bistro in town, praised for its ambience and renowned chef, they were eager to try it. The restaurant was tucked away in a charming alley, its exterior adorned with ivy and soft, golden lights that beckoned you inside. The smell of freshly baked bread and simmering sauces wafted through the air, creating the illusion of warmth and comfort. Everything about it seemed perfect, too perfect, perhaps. As they were seated at their table, nestled in a quiet corner of the room, the waitress handed them the menu with a smile. "Tonight, we're featuring our chef's special," she said. "It's a dish unlike anything you've ever had. You're in for a treat." The couple exchanged curious glances, intrigued by the enthusiasm in the waitress's voice, but little did they know, this was not a meal they would forget. As they perused the menu, the couple couldn't help but feel a growing sense of curiosity. The dishes were all beautifully described, each one more tempting than the last. But the chef's special, the dish that the waitress had mentioned, wasn't listed. Instead, it was written in elegant script at the top of the page, almost like a secret. The woman felt an odd thrill. They had come for something new, something different, and this special sounded like the perfect opportunity. When they asked about it again, the waiter nodded knowingly, his smile just a little too wide. "It's something you won't find anywhere else," he said, his tone almost reverent. "A recipe passed down through generations. Only the most discerning palates are chosen for it. Would you like to try it?" The man and woman exchanged a look. How could they resist? When the dish arrived, it was nothing like they expected. The presentation was simple, yet elegant. There were no extravagant garnishes or wild colors, just a single, unassuming plate with a dark, rich sauce and a perfectly cooked piece of meat in the center. It looked almost too perfect. The sauce shimmered under the low light, its deep color almost hypnotic, pulling them in with an irresistible allure. They both took a bite at the same time, and for a moment, everything was perfect. The flavors danced on their tongues, rich, complex, and utterly satisfying. But as the woman swallowed, a strange sensation washed over her. It wasn't just the taste of the food that left an impression. It was the way it seemed to linger in her mind, as though it were sticking to her, leaving behind an uncomfortable heaviness that didn't sit right. As the woman sat back, savoring the strange dish, an uncomfortable sensation began to creep over her. It started as a subtle unease, a prickling at the back of her neck. She glanced around the room, but nothing seemed amiss, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air around them felt heavier, thicker, almost suffocating. The soft murmurs of conversation seemed distant, as though they were muffled behind a wall. It was just the two of them now in the room. The other patrons, who had been there just moments ago, were now completely silent, staring blankly at their plates, their eyes hollow and unmoving. Their meals, just like the couple's, remained untouched. The woman reached for her wine glass, her hand trembling slightly, and took a long sip, trying to shake off the sudden wave of nausea. But as she lowered the glass, she noticed something she hadn't before. The shadows in the room had grown deeper, more oppressive. They stretched unnaturally across the walls, clinging to the corners as if something, or someone, was waiting in the dark. The waiter had disappeared, and the faint sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, began to echo in the room. But there was no one moving. Then, without warning, a cold draft swept through the room, making the woman shiver. She looked at her partner, who was now staring intently at the plate, his face pale. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice shaky. He didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the dish, his mouth slightly agape, as though in some sort of trance. She tried to snap him out of it, but he couldn't seem to hear her. That's when she saw it, the dish. The sauce, which had seemed so elegant before, now looked wrong. It was bubbling, oozing in thick, unnatural waves, as though something was alive within it. The once smooth surface now appeared to be rippling, a dark, murky liquid rising from the center, swirling in patterns that made no sense. She recoiled in disgust, but as she did, the room seemed to tilt, just for a moment, making her feel dizzy, as if the floor itself had shifted beneath her feet. Her heart was pounding now, her palms slick with sweat as she pushed her chair back and stood. She needed to leave, now. She could feel the oppressive weight of the air pressing down on her chest, the room closing in around her like a suffocating cage. But when she reached for the door, something stopped her. The door wouldn't budge. She turned the handle again and again, but it was locked. Panicking, she backed away, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The shadows in the room were no longer simply stretched. They were moving, crawling along the walls like dark tendrils of smoke, reaching toward her, closing the space between her and the exit. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. The whispering returned, but this time it was louder, more urgent. The voices had grown clearer. Though the words were still unintelligible, the tone was unmistakable. It was as though they were coming from every direction, from the very walls themselves. She turned to look at her partner, who had remained seated, staring vacantly at his untouched plate. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on the dish as if it were pulling him in, as if he were already lost to it. Suddenly, without warning, the plate of food began to vibrate. The dish shook violently, the sauce rising higher, swirling more intensely, as if something inside the dish was clawing its way to the surface. The woman felt a cold hand grip her heart. Her partner's head jerked up suddenly, and for the first time, his eyes locked onto hers, blank, hollow eyes, as though there was nothing left of the man she once knew. "It's too late," he whispered, his voice distorted, as though it weren't entirely his own. "It's already chosen us." The words sent a chill down her spine, and she stumbled backward, her hand reaching for anything to hold on to. The sound of silverware scraping across the table filled the air, and she turned to see the other diners still sitting motionless, their eyes fixed on the same dark, bubbling dish. It was as if they had all been consumed, trapped by whatever malevolent force had taken hold of them. And that's when she realized this wasn't just a meal. It was a ritual, a curse. The food had never been meant to nourish them. It had been meant to trap them, to bind them to the restaurant's dark history. The woman's mind raced, her panic rising to a crescendo as she backed further into the corner of the room. She tried to scream for help, but her voice was strangled in her throat, the air too thick, too suffocating for sound to escape. The whispers had grown louder, and now they seemed to press against her skull, filling her ears, filling her mind. The tendrils of darkness in the room seemed to grow stronger, moving like smoke, wrapping themselves around her, pulling her deeper into the nightmare. She turned to face her partner one last time, her heart breaking as she saw the emptiness in his eyes. He was no longer the man she had come here with. The meal, the curse, had taken him, just as it had taken the others before them. And then, through the haze of fear, she saw something more horrifying than she had ever imagined. The chef, the one who had created the dish, was no longer in the kitchen. He was standing in front of her now, his pale, ghostly face hovering just beyond the shadows. His eyes were black, like deep pits, and his smile was twisted, unnatural. He reached out toward her with one skeletal hand, his fingers long and bony, as though he were pulling the very darkness toward her. "Welcome," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of ages. "You're part of the dish now, part of the legacy." With a snap, his fingers curled, and the air around her grew colder, impossibly cold. The walls of the restaurant seemed to close in, and for a moment, she could feel the weight of the curse, how it had been passed down, how it had been waiting for the next soul to feed it. She turned and ran toward the back door, desperate, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. She turned back to face him, her heart sinking as she saw the waiter standing at the far end of the room, his smile now sinister, stretched too far. The room began to twist, the air thickening as the darkness swirled around her. It felt like time itself was being stretched, pulled apart as the last remnants of her reality disappeared. She tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the thickening fog. In her last moments of consciousness, she could hear the chef's voice, calm and detached, as if it were a distant memory. "The menu has been served," he said, "and now you will be part of it forever." It was past midnight when she felt the hunger pangs gnawing at her stomach. The city was quiet, the streets nearly empty, save for the occasional car passing by. She had just finished a late shift and didn't want to cook, so she decided to stop at the diner on the corner, a 24-hour place she'd passed by countless times. It was one of those diners that had a neon sign flickering steadily in the dark, its warm light casting a false sense of comfort in the night. But as she stepped inside, something immediately felt off. The diner, though typically bustling with activity at this hour, was eerily empty. There were no other customers, no chatter or clinking of silverware, only the hum of the old refrigerator and the occasional sizzle from the kitchen. The dim lights cast long shadows across the booth-lined walls, and the air had a strange, sterile quality to it, as though it had been sealed off from the outside world for far too long. She took a seat at one of the booths, her eyes scanning the menu, though she wasn't really hungry anymore. She felt an odd sense of unease, but she couldn't pinpoint why. The diner was too quiet, too still, and as she glanced around, she noticed something strange. The man sitting in the back booth, his gaze fixed squarely on her. His eyes were dark, his face expressionless, and he wasn't looking at the menu, nor was he even holding a drink. He was just sitting there, staring. For a moment, she wondered if he was simply a regular, but there was something about the way he sat there that sent a chill down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The waitress, who had appeared out of nowhere, her uniform pristine and her hair neatly tied back, arrived at her table with a smile that seemed just a little too wide, her eyes blank and glassy. "What can I get you tonight?" she asked in a monotone voice. There was no warmth in her tone, no human emotion. It was as if she had been programmed to say exactly those words, exactly in that way. The woman hesitated for a moment, watching her. The waitress didn't move. She didn't blink. It felt like she was waiting for the woman to say something, but when the woman ordered her food, the waitress nodded without another word and turned, moving in a way that didn't seem natural, too stiff, like someone following a script they couldn't deviate from. The woman shook her head, trying to push the creeping sense of discomfort aside, but as she waited for her food, the feeling grew stronger. Her eyes flicked back to the man in the back booth, who was still staring at her. His eyes never moved, never blinked, and she could feel his gaze weighing on her like a physical presence. She quickly turned her head, trying to ignore him, but then a whisper, so faint, so soft, it was almost lost beneath the clatter of the old kitchen fan. "Don't turn around." Her blood ran cold, her heart skipping a beat as she looked around. She was alone in the diner, save for the strange man and the seemingly robotic waitress, but she could have sworn the voice had come from behind her. Slowly, almost against her will, her body turned to face the source of the whisper. The man in the back booth hadn't moved, but somehow he was closer. Just a few feet away, now standing, his face devoid of any emotion, yet his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see into her very soul. The air around her grew cold, a chill that ran down her spine, settling deep into her bones. The man took a step toward her, his movements unnaturally slow and deliberate, like someone walking through water. The whispering grew louder now, soft murmurs, indistinguishable but urgent, filling her head. "Don't turn around, don't look away." The temperature in the diner dropped, and the woman shivered. The icy chill enveloped her, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end as she felt someone behind her. She could feel it, like the weight of 1,000 eyes. The waitress, who had disappeared into the kitchen, was now standing by the counter, motionless, watching. Her smile had disappeared, her face as empty and cold as the man's in the back booth. The air in the diner grew unbearably cold, her breath now visible in the sudden frost that seemed to hang in the air. Her instincts screamed for her to flee, but her body moved against her will, slowly turning to face the man who had been watching her so intently. The moment she turned, she froze. His face was wrong. It wasn't just the deep-set eyes, nor the unsettling stillness of his expression. No, it was more than that. His features were horribly disfigured, twisted, stretched unnaturally like a reflection of something that shouldn't be in this world. The skin was warped, a grotesque mask of half-melted flesh, the kind of distortion that looked as though it had been burned or ravaged by time itself. He didn't speak at first. He simply grinned, a wide, jagged smile that sent a wave of nausea through her. The smile wasn't human. It was inhuman, stretching too wide, too painfully across his face. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he spoke, his voice a rasping whisper that seemed to come from deep within the pits of the earth. "It's your turn now." Her heart thudded in her chest, the words sinking deep into her gut like a weight that threatened to crush her. She opened her mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Her mind raced, but her body remained frozen, as if held in place by some invisible force. With a final, desperate burst of energy, the woman broke free from the trance, her legs trembling as she stumbled toward the door. She didn't dare look back, her hands shaking as she turned the handle, pushing through the door into the cold night air. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her mind reeling from what she had just witnessed. She thought she had escaped, but something gnawed at her, the feeling that she was still trapped, that something was following her. She hurried down the street, trying to push the image of the man's face from her mind, but the memory was too vivid, too terrifying. She needed to get home, to put distance between herself and the nightmare she'd just left behind. But when she finally reached her apartment and sat down to calm her racing heart, a thought struck her. She hadn't even paid for the meal. The next morning, still shaken, she returned to the diner. It was the first place that came to her mind, a place she could maybe explain what had happened, or at least ask someone about it. But when she arrived, the place looked different. The neon sign was still there, but it was flickering weakly, like it had been abandoned for years. She walked in, expecting to be greeted, but the interior was even worse than she had imagined. The booths were worn, covered in dust, the lights dim and flickering erratically. There were no customers, no staff, just the ghost of a once bustling diner. Confused, she approached the counter, but there was no one there. No one at all. Feeling her heart race, she asked the person at the counter, the same man who had greeted her the night before. But when he turned to face her, she saw only an empty, crumbling face. It wasn't the same man, not the one who had smiled and whispered to her. His figure was blurred, as if it had faded away into nothing. Panicking, she grabbed her phone and searched for the diner's name. Her blood ran cold as she read the results. The diner had been closed for years. It had been shut down, abandoned after a fire had devastated the building. There were no records of the meal she had eaten, no record of the staff, no trace of her visit. It was as if she had never been there at all. But she had seen it. She had felt it. And now, as she stood in front of the empty restaurant, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed a threshold, a boundary between the living and the dead that could never be undone. Which of these horrifying restaurant experiences scared you the most? Have you ever had a strange or unsettling encounter at a place you thought was safe? Maybe you felt a presence you couldn't explain or witnessed something that made you question reality. If so, we'd love to hear your story. Share your experience in the comments below and let us know what made it so chilling. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more chilling tales just like these. We bring you the darkest, most unsettling stories every week, so stay tuned if you dare.